In 1978, police in a quiet suburb outside Chicago made a routine visit to the home of a local contractor. They were following up on the disappearance of a teenage boy. The man who answered the door was polite, cooperative, even offered to help. He cracked a few jokes, mentioned he was active in the community, and told them he had no idea who the missing teen was. But inside that house, behind a locked crawlspace door, was something the officers could not have imagined. That small space would eventually lead to the discovery of one of the most disturbing serial crime cases in U.S. history. This is the story of a man who dressed as a clown for kids' birthday parties and led a double life so dark it shocked the entire nation. This is the true story of John Wayne Gacy. In the 1970s, Gacy was a familiar face around Norwood Park, a middle-class neighborhood near Chicago. He was the kind of guy who showed up at parades, donated to political campaigns, and hosted neighborhood barbecues. He even performed at children's hospitals as Pogo the Clown, his self-created character with a painted face and oversized shoes. To his neighbors, Gacy was harmless, funny even. But Gacy's public image was just that, an image. Behind the charm was a deeply manipulative and volatile man who used his position in the community to gain trust and then abuse it. Gacy ran a small construction company, PDM contractors, and often hired teenage boys to help with odd jobs. Many of these boys were from vulnerable backgrounds, looking for work or independence. Gacy, with his affable demeanor and promises of money, positioned himself as someone offering a helping hand. But something strange began to happen. Some of the boys who worked for him disappeared. Their families reported them missing, but there were no signs of struggle, no crime scenes, and often no clear leads. And because many of the missing were teenagers, authorities sometimes assumed they had run away. That would turn out to be a fatal assumption. The case that finally broke the surface started with a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest. In December 1978, Robert was last seen at the pharmacy where he worked. He told his mother he was going outside to speak with a man about a potential job, someone who ran a contracting business. He never came back. When police began to investigate, the lead brought them straight to Gacy's house. He admitted he had been at the pharmacy, but denied ever speaking to the boy. Still, something about his tone raised red flags. He was too confident, too rehearsed, and so police dug deeper. As they looked into Gacy's background, they discovered something chilling. Years earlier, in 1968, Gacy had served time in Iowa for assaulting a teenage boy. He'd been sentenced to 10 years, but only served 18 months before being released. That conviction had been buried in his past. Until now. Authorities secured a search warrant for Gacy's home. The first search turned up odd clues: handcuffs, driver's licenses that didn't belong to him, and a strong, strange odor coming from the crawl space beneath the house. But nothing conclusive. Then, while under surveillance, Gacy began to unravel. Officers watching his house noticed Gacy's behavior change. He stopped sleeping, started drinking heavily, and told one officer flat out, "You're going to kill me." It was clear something was wrong. Soon after, Gacy walked into his lawyer's office and reportedly confessed everything. Police moved in with a second warrant, and this time they opened the crawl space. What they found underneath that house would shake even the most experienced investigators. Packed into the narrow, dirt-lined space were multiple remains. The exact number wasn't immediately clear, but as they carefully removed each one, it became apparent. This had been going on for years. In total, authorities would recover 29 individuals from under Gacy's house. 4 more were later discovered in nearby rivers. That brought the total to 33 confirmed victims, all young men and boys, many of whom had been missing for years. Many never identified to this day. The community was stunned. Neighbors who had attended parties at Gacy's house couldn't comprehend what had happened beneath their feet. Some had even used the bathroom that vented above the crawl space and had commented on the smell, assuming it was plumbing. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. During questioning, he maintained a strange and detached attitude, sometimes joking, sometimes defensive. He insisted that a part of him, an alter ego he called Jack, was the one responsible. But the court wasn't convinced. In 1980, Gacy stood trial in Illinois. His defense tried to plead insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. After a lengthy trial and harrowing testimony from those who had escaped his clutches, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, the most ever attributed to a single individual in the U.S. at the time. He was sentenced to death. For the next 14 years, Gacy remained on death row. During that time, he painted. Many of the paintings were of clowns. Some were sold, others were destroyed by buyers who couldn't stomach owning something created by him. He granted interviews, often blaming his victims or denying responsibility. He showed little remorse. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His last words were reported to be, "Kiss my..." In July of 1991, a man ran out of an apartment complex in Milwaukee, handcuffed and terrified. He flagged down 2 police officers and begged for help, saying someone had tried to restrain him. The man led the officers back to the apartment where he'd escaped. They knocked. The door opened. The man inside was calm, polite. He offered an explanation. "Just a misunderstanding," he said. The officers almost believed him until they stepped inside. What they found next would horrify not just Milwaukee, but the entire world. This is the story of a man who, for more than a decade, lived in plain sight while hiding something so dark that many still struggle to understand it. This is the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Ohio, the son of a chemist and a homemaker. By all appearances, his early childhood was ordinary, but even as a young boy, Jeffrey developed a strange curiosity. He was interested in how things worked on the inside. While other kids played with toys, Jeffrey collected insects, bones, and small animals. He wasn't violent. He was quiet, detached. But there was something different about him, something that went unnoticed for years. By the time he reached high school, Dahmer was isolated. He drank heavily and began showing signs of deep psychological instability. But still, he managed to function. He graduated. He even joined the army for a short time, but nothing stuck. He was discharged, moved in with family, and eventually found himself alone in Milwaukee, working odd jobs, living in low-rent apartments, and spiraling. It was there, in that small one-bedroom apartment on North 25th Street, that his double life took shape. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer committed a series of crimes so calculated and disturbing, investigators struggled to comprehend the full extent. His victims were mostly young men and boys, many of them from marginalized communities. Some were lured from bus stops, clubs, or the street. Dahmer would invite them home, offering money, a drink, or just a place to hang out. Once inside, the door closed, and the truth about what happened behind that door wouldn't come to light for more than a decade. Dahmer's methods were cold and meticulous. He often drugged his victims before they were fully aware of what was happening. Some attempted to leave, but couldn't. Others never had the chance. He kept detailed records. He took photographs. And most chillingly, he preserved things, items no one could have imagined. In his apartment, police later discovered a refrigerator with remains, filing cabinets containing bones, and an entire room converted into something he referred to as a shrine. But no one knew. For years, no one suspected a thing. Neighbors at the Oxford apartments complained about the smell. Dahmer would always have an answer. Bad meat, a broken fridge, fish that had gone bad. People accepted it. He was quiet, minding his own business, always alone. And because many of his victims were individuals who didn't have strong social safety nets, some without stable housing or family nearby, no one came looking. That silence allowed him to continue. But in July 1991, that all changed because one person got away. Tracy Edwards was 32 years old when he met Dahmer. The two had a conversation, and Dahmer invited him over to his apartment. At first, everything seemed normal. They listened to music. Dahmer offered him a drink. But soon, Tracy began to feel uneasy. There were strange smells, odd behavior. And then, Dahmer pulled out handcuffs. Tracy resisted. He stayed calm, trying to talk Dahmer down. He waited for a chance. And when Dahmer's attention drifted, he made a break for it, running straight to police. When officers entered apartment 213 with Tracy, they weren't expecting what they found. The place looked cluttered, but not unusual, until they opened a drawer. Inside were photos, dozens of them, showing scenes that no one could explain. Then came the refrigerator, and the freezer, and the barrels in the bedroom. The apartment was a crime scene unlike anything law enforcement had ever seen. Dahmer was arrested that night. During questioning, he confessed in a detached, unemotional voice. He described everything: how he met each victim, what happened in his apartment, how he tried to keep the truth hidden. He admitted to 17 confirmed murders, though many believe there could have been more. The press called him the Milwaukee Monster. But when the trial began in early 1992, what shocked the public most was how calm he was, how normal he looked. Glasses, slouched posture. Speaking politely to the judge, he didn't try to deny it. In fact, he said he wanted to plead guilty, not insane. He knew what he was doing, and he said he didn't want freedom. He wanted to disappear. The court didn't grant him that. Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences. He was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he reportedly spent his time reading the Bible and drawing. But not everyone believed justice had been done. In the early 1970s, across the peaceful tree-lined campuses of the Pacific Northwest, something strange was happening. Young women, bright, ambitious, full of life, were vanishing. No break-ins, no struggle. One minute they were walking to class or out with friends, and the next they were gone. At first, no one connected the dots. These were isolated cases. At least that's what people wanted to believe. But for one Seattle woman, something about these stories felt too familiar. And she was right. This is the story of a man who appeared to have it all together. Intelligent, confident, charming. Someone you'd trust to watch your dog or help you change a tire. But behind that mask was a person living a double life, one that would leave a trail of devastation across the country. This is the true story of Ted Bundy. In 1974, college students in Washington state began reporting strange encounters. A man, tall, well-dressed, polite, approached women on campus, often asking for help with his books or claiming he had injured his arm. He spoke softly, smiled a lot, and introduced himself as Ted. Most people didn't think twice. He looked like a law student, someone with a future. But when several women disappeared, always after similar conversations with the same man, patterns started to emerge. Witnesses described the same things: the man's calm voice, his cast or crutches, and most chillingly, his tan Volkswagen Beetle. That car became a silent signature of something much darker. At the time, law enforcement was struggling. These incidents were happening across multiple counties and even states. There was no shared database, no central task force. Cases stayed within their own borders. Meanwhile, the man in the Beetle was always one step ahead. One of the few who saw through the mask was Elizabeth Kendall, Ted Bundy's longtime girlfriend. She had been with him for years. They went on dates. He helped raise her daughter. But as reports of missing women grew, so did her suspicions. Bundy had a tendency to disappear for long stretches. His moods would change suddenly. And once, she even found surgical tools in his car. Still, when she voiced her concerns to police, she gave them his name, his car make and model. They didn't follow through. He was just too normal. But Bundy wasn't just moving between towns, he was moving between lives. In Washington, he was a political volunteer. In Utah, he was a law student. In Colorado, he was just passing through. But wherever he went, women vanished. And when their remains were found in forested remote areas, sometimes months later, it was always the same disturbing pattern. Remote locations, signs of blunt trauma, and no witnesses. Eventually, a major break came when a young woman named Carol Duranch managed to escape. She had been approached at a mall in Utah by a man claiming to be a police officer. He said her car had been broken into and offered to take her to the station. But once she got into his car, things changed. He drove the wrong direction. When she questioned him, he suddenly pulled over, pulled out handcuffs, and tried to restrain her. But Carol fought back. She kicked, screamed, and managed to get away, running straight to the real police. Her story led to a sketch, and finally, a match. In 1975, police pulled over a Volkswagen Beetle in Salt Lake City. The driver matched the description: calm, polite, but evasive. Inside the car, they found handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and a crowbar. That man was Ted Bundy. And even though the items raised red flags, police only charged him with attempted kidnapping. They didn't yet realize they were face-to-face with one of the most dangerous individuals in modern criminal history. Bundy was sentenced to prison in Utah, but the story was far from over. While awaiting trial for a separate case in Colorado, Bundy managed to do something that shocked even seasoned detectives. He escaped. Not once, but twice. The first time, he leapt out of a second-story courthouse window while left unattended during a legal meeting. He disappeared into the mountains for 6 days before being caught. The second time, it was more calculated. He carved a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell, crawled through the building's ductwork, changed into civilian clothing, and walked out the front door. This time, he didn't stop running. In January of 1978, Bundy resurfaced in Florida. What happened next would mark the most violent chapter in his long chain of crimes. Just before 3 a.m. on January 15th, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened inside lasted less than 15 minutes. When it was over, 2 students were dead and 2 more were severely injured. The attacks were brutal and senseless. There was no clear motive, just a sudden eruption of violence. 2 weeks later, in Lake City, Florida, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her school. Her case, unlike the others, involved a much younger victim and drew national attention. It would become the crime that finally closed the door on Bundy's freedom. He was arrested in February 1978 after a routine traffic stop. The officer noticed his plates were stolen, and once in custody, Bundy tried giving a fake name. But it didn't work. His real identity was soon confirmed, and so were the growing charges against him. In 1979, Bundy went on trial for the Florida State murders. It was the first nationally televised criminal trial in U.S. history. Bundy, ever the manipulator, chose to represent himself in court. He questioned witnesses, objected to evidence, and at one point even proposed to a woman in the courtroom, on record during proceedings. She said yes, but none of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming. One of the key pieces was a dental match from a bite mark left on one of the victims. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. A second trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach followed, and again, he was sentenced to death. Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row. During that time, he began confessing to more crimes, at least 30 across 7 states. He gave interviews to FBI profiler Robert Ressler and crime author Stephen Michaud. He claimed to be helping investigators understand people like him, but to many, it felt like a final act of control. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. In the early 1980s, near the banks of the Green River in Washington state, fishermen made a horrifying discovery: a body in the water. Police were called. Then, just a few weeks later, another was found. Then another. All women, all young, all missing. At first, no one knew they were connected, but over time, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The cases stacked up quickly, more than law enforcement could process. It was like the river itself was giving back what someone else had tried to hide. The killer, whoever he was, seemed to vanish into thin air after each incident. No one ever saw him. There were no fingerprints, no obvious clues, just a rising count of lives taken and a city that slowly became paralyzed with fear. And the man responsible? He lived just a few miles away, worked a steady job, paid his taxes, smiled at neighbors. No one suspected a thing. This is the true story of Gary Ridgway, the man who came to be known as the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway grew up in SeaTac, Washington, just outside Seattle. His early life was troubled. Strict parents, a cold household, and a deep sense of social isolation. From a young age, he struggled to connect with others, especially women. Friends later described him as quiet, unremarkable, and often uncomfortable in social settings. After high school, Ridgway joined the Navy and served a tour in Vietnam. When he returned, he settled into a routine life. He got married more than once, worked as a truck painter at a local factory, and kept mostly to himself. But behind that ordinary exterior was someone who had developed deeply rooted resentment, a strong need for control, and a disturbing view of relationships. And starting in 1982, those inner thoughts would spill over into something much worse. That year, Ridgway began targeting vulnerable women, often those who were experiencing homelessness or involved in survival-based sex work along Pacific Highway South, a busy stretch of road outside Seattle. He'd offer a ride, a meal, or money. Once they were in his truck, he'd take them to wooded areas, sometimes near the Green River, where the pattern of his crimes began to unfold. For a long time, there were no leads. These crimes were difficult to trace. Most of the victims didn't have close families nearby, and their disappearances didn't trigger major investigations at first, but the bodies kept turning up. In the water, in the woods, near highways. By 1983, it was clear this wasn't isolated. King County law enforcement formed a task force and began piecing the cases together. They called the unknown suspect the Green River Killer. The community was on edge. Rumors circulated. And still, no one had any idea who it was. Incredibly, Gary Ridgway was actually questioned early in the investigation. His name came up more than once. He owned a pickup truck similar to the one described by a surviving victim. He had a history of visiting sex workers. He even failed a polygraph test. But without hard evidence, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. He slipped through the cracks. Over the next 2 decades, the case went cold. Bodies stopped turning up as frequently, and the investigation stalled. Technology in the 1980s and 90s just wasn't advanced enough to match DNA with the small traces left behind. But in 2001, everything changed. New DNA testing had become more precise, and investigators began re-examining old evidence, scraps of clothing, hair fibers, and other small items preserved from the original scenes. When they tested samples found on multiple victims, they got a match. Gary Ridgway was arrested in November 2001. At first, he denied everything, but when the evidence became impossible to refute, Ridgway did something no one expected. He began talking. In exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, Ridgway agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. What he told them was overwhelming. He confessed to more than 70 killings, most of them in Washington, spanning from 1982 to the late 1990s. He led police to undiscovered locations. He provided names when he could remember them. And in court, he sat in a plain shirt and glasses, calmly describing what he had done. To law enforcement, it was a breakthrough. To families of the victims, it was devastating. Many of them had waited decades for answers. Some were never given the chance to bury their loved ones properly. In court, Ridgway showed little emotion, except once, when the father of one of the victims stood up during sentencing and said, "I don't hate you. I forgive you." Ridgway, for the first time, broke down in tears. But for most, there was no forgiveness. only the painful realization that the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight, going to work, grocery shopping, walking among them. In 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Over time, he would confess to even more. To this day, investigators believe the real number may be higher than 90. In 2012, a young barista named Samantha Koenig didn't come home after her shift at a small coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska. Security footage showed her being led away by a man in a ski mask. Police assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, but weeks later, her family received a text message from her phone. It gave them directions to a public park where they found a note and a photo that seemed to show Samantha alive. And there was something else, a demand for ransom. But what no one knew, not her family, not the police, not the community, was that Samantha had already been gone for some time. The photo had been staged. The message was a manipulation, and the person behind it wasn't just some random criminal. He was one of the most terrifying kinds of people you could ever encounter. Methodical, mobile, and entirely without remorse. This is the story of Israel Keyes, a man who lived like a ghost and hunted like a predator, hidden in plain sight. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Utah and raised in a large, isolated family in rural Washington. From early on, he kept to himself. He was quiet, smart. He grew up with a rigid worldview and later rejected much of the ideology he had been raised in. In his 20s, he served in the U.S. Army. Fellow soldiers described him as normal, even easygoing. After his service, he ran a construction business in Alaska and blended seamlessly into the community. No one suspected that Keyes had already been active, carefully planning a series of crimes that would span years across multiple states and leave almost no trace. He had a system, and it worked. He would travel, sometimes flying, sometimes driving across the country, but he didn't choose victims randomly. He buried kill kits, sealed containers with weapons, supplies, restraints near towns he had no connection to. Sometimes he planted them years in advance. Then he'd return, open the kit, find a house, wait, and just like that, he would disappear again. He didn't kill out of impulse. He planned it like a project. He used cash only. He stayed off major highways. He turned off his phone, and when it was over, he went back to his normal life. Business meetings, family vacations, errands. By the time police caught up with him, they were too late for Samantha Koenig, but her case broke his cover. Keyes had taken her late at night, held her for hours, and then, after what he called just waiting, ended her life and hid the evidence. But in the following days, he posed her body to make it appear she was still alive and used a prepaid phone to send text messages to her father with a staged ransom photo. He withdrew money from her debit card from ATM machines across several states. That's how he was tracked. In Texas, he slipped up, driving a car that had been linked to the Anchorage disappearance and using the same ATM card too many times. Police arrested him and brought him back to Alaska. And that's when the full story began to unfold. In custody, Keyes didn't act like most criminals. He didn't deny what he had done. He didn't try to cut a deal. He spoke matter-of-factly, almost as if he were talking about a job he once had and no longer needed. He confessed to killing at least 11 people, but refused to name most of them. He said he liked keeping some things to himself. Control, for him, was the point. He revealed details about a case in Vermont where a couple had vanished without a trace. Keyes had flown in, rented a car, used one of his pre-buried kits, and attacked them in their home. Then he drove hundreds of miles, returned the car, flew home, and went on with his life. That case was eventually confirmed. Bill and Lorraine Currier, missing since 2011. Their home had been broken into, and they had simply vanished. Until Keyes spoke, no one even knew it was a homicide. He told investigators that many of his crimes were like that, unlinked, spread out, years apart. Some may never be identified. In one conversation, he even said, "You won't find them. I did it right." But before investigators could learn everything, Keyes made one final move. In December 2012, while in solitary confinement in an Anchorage jail, Israel Keyes took his own life.